everyone, welcome to a monthly or almost monthly podcast about books that game developers should read, or maybe they shouldn't. That's kind of the whole point. We do a review of a series of books, some of which are kind of key texts about game design and about making games. Some of them are adjacent things that are to do with other disciplines that game developers can learn from, because games are weird assemblages of every art form that human beings have ever engaged in, which is part of what makes them so delightful to make and so frustrating sometimes. I'm Dr. Joe Baxter-Webb from the Indie Game Clinic, and I am joined today by a special guest, Jeremy Johnson.
I guess I'm Dr. Jeremy Miles Johnson. Also, I have to throw the miles in or else no one can find me on the internet.
It's for the SEO.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I'm an indie game developer, and I've been teaching, we're creeping up on a decade now teaching game development. You know, I started with this book, The Art of Game Design. I know it's not the sexy choice. It's like when you ask for a movie recommendation and people recommend Godfather or something, you know, it's like, of course. But yeah, I love this book, so I'm happy to be here. I'm glad I got to be the one to talk about it, because I know somebody was going to talk about it. So.
And you've taught it lots of times, right?
I make my students, we work through it every year, across two classes, the game design classes. So we get about halfway through and then finish it up in the last half.
There'll be people listening to this who've read this as a hobbyist and maybe didn't get on very well with the book, and they'll be kind of tearing their hair out at that suggestion and thinking, this guy's evil. Why would he do that? What is it about this book that you think makes it such a good one to, teach in its entirety for a start? Because often when we're teaching academic classes, we pick and choose bits from here and there. We excerpt one chapter from one book and so on. So what is it about this book that you think makes it worthwhile teaching the entire thing?
Well, I think, first of all, just like what you were talking about when you introduced it, that this book takes a holistic approach to game design, right? So it really looks at all the pieces. And that's kind of what my program does at St. Edward's, where I teach, that students don't specialize. We're a small liberal arts university, so we can't afford to specialize. And so students are taking, playwriting classes from a playwright and art classes from artists. And then we've got to bring them together and sort of stitch it together. So I really like that this book is not just, about game design. It reaches out and shows all these other disciplines and how they interact, and even how whatever it is in game design is relevant to these other disciplines, or how, two things are doing the same thing, whether they're games or not. So I really like that aspect of it. And it's also, I think you said this in your first game developers library, you or Tom, one of you said it, where you're talking about it being like the 1,000-foot view of game development, which I think is good for students, because, when they're making games, they're at the, 1 millimeter view, and, wrestling with code and fighting bugs. And it's nice to once a week pull them all the way back and make them sort of analyze some aspect of what they've been doing. So that's why I really like this book.
It's an incredibly broad book. It's a game design book, so you can apply the things in it to making a board game, tabletop RPG, escape room. Jesse Schell was a Disney Imagineer in the 90s, which means he worked on like MMOs for Disney. He worked on mixed reality rides, and there's loads of examples from those in there. And those are some of the most interesting examples, I think, not to dive too deep too soon, but they're great because you couldn't argue they weren't a video game, but they're so unlike anything that any of us will ever develop as a video game. Right. But yeah, before we get into the specifics of it, I think I wanted to sort of talk about some problems people might have with the book, because if you were to go and kind of do a search on Reddit, on a game development subreddit or something for this, you will find people that have read this and really not got on with it. There's a lot of talk about how it's not very practical. There's a lot of dismissal of it as too theoretical, which I think is interesting, because what else can a book be? It's like when it comes to and fundamentally a lot of it comes down to people expecting design to be development and expecting design to be technical implementation of a thing. And ultimately, you know, the only book you can really read that's going to teach you how to do that is the manual of whatever tool you're learning, not a textbook so much. So I wanted to address that up front because I know a lot of people who come from more of a technical background find the content of this book very touchy-feely. But I also think if that's someone's perspective on it, then they probably just don't like game design as a discipline, and they don't like thinking about it, and they may just, and I say just an engineer, but it is totally fine to be into making games and to be focused on being an engineer and not want to design. And this is why we have these separations within larger teams. But I would foreground that just right at the start, because I know there'll be people listening to this who've read it before, hated it, and can't understand why we're so enthusiastic about it. I love it. I think it is probably one of the best books I've read on this topic, but you really have to go into it with that acceptance of the fact that the design of the game isn't the technical part. It's what makes the game good. It's what makes the game enjoyable. It's what makes the game into a particular type of experience. It's really nothing to do with the implementation, although there are lots of sections in this, and I forgot about them until I reread it this time, that are very, very helpful to do with that. And just to give one example, the idea of like the length of an iteration loop. And it might not give you examples of how to do that, but I found myself giving this advice over and over again. People say, you know, how do I balance my game? And I say, well, where are the variables in the game? And they say, well, they're scattered around the game in a million different objects. And I say, well, do you think maybe it would be easier to balance and tweak and play if they were all in a spreadsheet? And you could, that's the kind of thing where it's like you do have to make the leap from what he's saying to how you implement it in your game, whatever your game is.
Yeah.
But to say it's impractical, I feel like the only people who could say that would be people who've like misremembered it or skipped large chunks of it. It's just worth framing it that way up front, because there are definitely some people that don't get on very well with this kind of experience-focused game design stuff.
Well, I also think, right, like if you sit down and you're like, decide to be a game designer and you just sit down and read this cover to cover, that's maybe not the optimal way to use this book, right? I think if you're doing some things and then you come back to this book and think like, why isn't this working? And then you go back, you know, it's really helpful in that way, I think, as like smaller bites, because it's a lot to digest in one chunk, right? And in this sort of abstract way where it's not giving you concrete examples.
Well, that's the other thing, is that it is a book that is part of a framework. So if for people who are totally unfamiliar with this, Jesse Schell wrote this book, The Art of Game Design, a book of lenses, and there is a deck of lenses, which is a card that comes along with it, and it is similar to Brian Eno's Oblique Strategies, and the idea is you've got this deck of cards and you can pull one out at random and it will just give you a thing to think about, like a prompt to think about your game. And you could just sit there and go through them, and I've heard him talking in interviews about how he uses them with his team. Sometimes they will sit down and pick 3 cards each and then have a focus group where they look at a game with, you know, each with a particular set of problems to think about. Sometimes it's a case of going through them and actively picking out the cards that represent the things that are most relevant to the game, you know. So you might throw away all the cards that are to do with story if your game is completely abstract, and so on. So it is really kind of, it's similar to, you know, doing divination with a tarot deck. Long-term watchers of my channel will have suspected for a long time that I might be an evil wizard, but I've got like, you know, I've got Aleister Crowley's Thoth deck over there, which is Aleister Crowley's deck of tarot cards, and there's a book called the Book of Thoth, and you can read the Book of Thoth and it explains it, but it's not the same as actually doing the thing and applying the thing, and becoming an evil wizard, right? You don't have to have the deck of cards, but I will put a link in the description of this podcast that there's a digital version of this online where you can just like get a random thing from a website and it will give you a prompt, it will give you something to think about. So the way that the book is structured, it takes you through these lenses one by one, and then between them links them up with theory from all sorts of different places, right? Yeah,
and that's, I really like that, because, you know, he's got a lot of game references. That's the thing I'm always trying to get my students to, like, go look at the end of the chapter, go get those books, go get those articles and read them, right? Because a lot of them are games but there's also a lot of, like psychology papers, and there's one interview with Mr. Rogers in front of Congress and stuff like that, right? And so all of these things I think are really valuable and put a lot of the lenses into context. But yeah, I really like the lenses. I think even if you just pick one at random, you either have to, justify your game decisions in terms of this card, or justify why this card's not relevant for your game. But every card sort of, gives you something to think about. And so I particularly like it because, we all have our strengths and weaknesses. And when you get that card that you pull out and you're like, oh, I haven't thought about this at all. I don't tend to think about this right now suddenly, you don't.
Yeah, I was trying to use them as I reread the book, and I did an exercise where I went through them and I tried to think of which areas I'm weakest at based on the most recent project I've been working on, and there were a few that just jumped out immediately, and I wouldn't have really thought of them if I didn't have them in front of me. And it was things like sense making. It was like trying to do too much weird stuff in one game, and then I was like, okay, I'm guilty of that one. People don't know they've got these weak spots until someone shows them a thing that says, hey, did you know this is important? And they go, well, it's not important to me. It's like, well, you're not making something just for yourself. You're making something for other people. And the other thing about this book is that he says this in the introduction to it, and I've also heard him express this in a bunch of different interviews, is that when he set out to write it, he had other people who worked in games say to him, oh, you can't make a good book about game design, and the reason is that games are too diverse, and something you say about one type of game won't apply elsewhere, and so on and so on. And we see this problem time and time again when you get very formalist accounts of games, like the stuff that people in the board game space do, and then it's like, well, there's a visual novel over here and it's still a game and we still call it a game, and none of this stuff applies. And that's why he formulated the entire thing as questions, because the approach was basically questions can't be wrong.
Yeah, and I think that's good, because I think a lot of times people get tangled up on that back in the thing you just said, where they stop worrying about the formalism and start arguing, like, according to this formalism, that thing that you're making is not a game, right? And then they get tangled up in, is a visual novel a game, and it's like not useful.
The kind of general structure of this book is you get asked a series of questions for each of these lenses. Here's some questions to think about your game, and then surrounding it is theory that takes us from one of these questions to the next one. And a lot of this theory isn't about games. It's about human psychology, perception, and examples from different things. So there's an example where he's talking about constrained choice, and he gives this example of when he used to work at the fun fair and people would come up and they had all these different flavors of candy. And if he told them that we have every flavor, they would sort of freak out and stand there for ages. Yeah. If he told them they just had 3, then they'd be like, well, I want to know what all these others are. So he would say, we've got every flavor you could imagine, but our most popular flavors are this, this, and this. And that would give them a sense of like choice, but being guided towards. There's loads of little examples like that. Some of them are anecdotal. Some of them are from actual studies and stuff. But he got his start as a juggler, I think, as we get that in the introduction. So he's got this whole background in magic and entertaining people sort of face to face, which I think is kind of intriguing.
And that story about the interest curves, right? And like how he discovered interest curves in this experience by doing his juggling routine. And then somebody was like, if you put this trick here and move that trick here, like suddenly the audience will be really excited. So.
Yeah, and I don't know if your experience of game developers has been like this, particularly sort of solo developers, people that design games on their own or whatever, but the amount of people that just have these very strange hybrid backgrounds. Like I remember the first job I got in a studio, I was an assistant producer, and we were co-developing with another studio, and there was a much more senior designer there, and she was an organist in a black metal band outside of work. It's like, and I think there's like a survivorship bias in game dev where the only games that actually get made and finished are by people who can program, right? Because if you can't program, you can't make anything. But it's like you need to be able to program to make a video game exist, but that doesn't necessarily make the video game good, right? So
Right.
the people who can make something good tend to have some understanding of how to entertain people, some understanding of how to make fun happen. And so often that seems to come from somewhere else, right? You
Right.
know, because it's like, I don't know. I don't know how much left brain, right brain stuff is sort of accepted anymore, but it's like it has to come from somewhere else, because it's not going to come from the kind of rational computer science side of things, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that my background was my degrees. I have a degree in physics and I have a degree in translating ancient Greek. And that was my pair. I got those at the same time in undergrad, and at the same time I was also working in a gallery and selling art on the side to sort of pay through my way through school. So yeah, so I'm all about, and I think like you find, especially in game development education, that anybody with one or more gray hairs doesn't have a degree in games because there wasn't a degree in games, right? Yeah. And so it's bringing in people from all over. But, you know, I have a bunch of students that are just minoring in game development, and they're coming over from animation or sometimes biology or something like that, and they make fantastic games, right? And it's just this tacked on thing they're putting on their other experience. But yeah, I think that I often think with students, hopefully they play a lot of games. A lot of times they play, you know, the big commercial games and then not a lot of indie games. Mm-hmm. But I also am like, go watch this movie, go listen to this music, go find things, you know, like all of this stuff comes back to game development. Go read weird books, you know, all of that stuff. I think having that experience. I mean, Jesse Schell says it in this book too. It's like, I think right at the beginning, he's like, here's all the things you need to know to be a game developer. Right?
Yeah, and it's like architecture and fashion and all of these things. And like, obviously it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but I think it's particularly relevant for the kind of people that I'm often communicating with, because in the kind of YouTube game dev space, there are so many people that are trying to chase the kind of solo developer thing.
Yeah.
And that does mean that you have to wear even more of the hats, and you can cut big sections of this out by saying, oh, my game doesn't have a story, or my game doesn't have representations of people in it, or something like that. But there are a lot of people trying to do it all. And I often think the best way to learn is to start off trying to do it all, and then work out what your specialism, and then ideally getting into a place where you can drop stuff. And like when I used to teach at university, we had a generalist, it was called game design, but it was a generalist game dev course. Had some really strong students that came in from like a pure literature background or just some other type of craft. I remember having a student once where, you know, they came and they said, oh, you know, I don't have the grades for this course, blah, blah, blah. I'm a carpenter. And it was like, well, you understand practice and you understand craft, right? And that kind of meta level understanding of how to learn to do things tends to transfer. But yeah, I mean, we're getting way into, I'm saying we're getting off the point of the book, but the book is so much about this kind of interdisciplinary thinking of like, you know, a game is an experience, and you can take stuff from anywhere. You know, I looked at Raf Koster's theory of fun last month, and that's so narrow in its idea of what games are, what the interesting part of games is. Every time Raf Koster in that book tries to narrow down what games are or what fun is, this book does the opposite and opens it out. And it's like, okay, in Raf Koster's version, there's all of these like side types of pleasures, like surprise at finding a random thing, or schadenfreude for seeing your opponent lose, and all of those kind of things. And he's like, these aren't fun. Fun is this own separate thing. Whereas Schell has this very inclusive definition of fun, where you know, puzzles are included, toys are included, and I really like that. That's quite early on. It's in the first section where it's kind of, he has this approach he talks about, which is make a toy that's fun to interact with, and then add the goals that make it a game afterwards. And I think that can be a really kind of helpful way of encouraging new developers to think about games, because it forces you to think about the little interactions rather than the big sprawling like inventory systems and all of that kind of stuff.
That's exactly, so in my courses, that's sort of for a couple of projects early on, I have them, you know, incrementally, they make a toy first. Then they make, you know, a prototype of their game, and you know, but at the beginning, I don't want to see a score, I don't want to see a system, I don't know whether, you know what I mean, is it fun to click around, is it fun to move? If that's true, we can go from there. If that's not fun, whatever else you add won't be fun, right?
The other thing about the structure of the book is it has this kind of diagram. It kind of builds up bit by bit as you work through the book, because it would be quite overwhelming if you saw it right up front. And that is replicated in the little kind of explainer for the deck, where you've got these sections. You've got the experience, the player, the game and the game mechanics, the process of game design and development, which is the practical stuff like iteration loops and stuff, and then the designer. And these are like all of the things that go into a game, and he has this big map of it, and as you work through the chapters, it sort of expands the map and talks about how these areas are related to each other.
Yeah, right at the end he has the full picture, and then if you start with that, you bounce off of it immediately, but it builds it up one little piece at a time, which is nice.
Yeah, and the earlier kind of model that we get that's sort of part of that is the elemental tetrad as well, which was one of the things we used to teach from this book. We didn't teach very heavily from the book. We would just sort of encourage people to read it. But the elemental tetrad was one of the first things we encouraged people to look at. So this scary sounding thing is just a model with 4 areas. And at the bottom, we've got technology. And then we've got mechanics and story in the middle, and aesthetics at the top. And the way he talks about this is that the aesthetics are the more visible thing. They're the thing the player sees most. And then the technology is the invisible thing that the player doesn't see. And then the mechanics and story are there, but they're less obvious than the aesthetics. But the point of it being a tetrad is that all of the things are interconnected. And when the way I would use this with a student is you would initially use it to analyze existing games to see how these things are connected, right?
Yeah.
So you would think about, in Rock Band, the technology is this silly plastic guitar. Like, how does that relate to the other things on here? It relates to the mechanics because we're using it to press the corresponding colored buttons that appear on the screen. We're not using it to like fly a plane or anything. And it relates to the aesthetics because Rock Band has this kind of slightly goofy cartoony look to it. You can start to draw these lines between all of these elements of the game.
Yeah. And you've got to hold the guitar to feel like you're actually rocking out, right? That's
yeah, exactly.
If you don't have a cheap plastic guitar, are you really rocking?
So what's your experience of teaching with this generally? Are there specific bits that you focus on? Are there any areas that you find new students of game design struggle with particularly? There
is something I find there's often something in most chapters to focus on. There's a couple chapters I don't love. We can talk about that later. I find particularly a lot of it's funny because it's not a weakness I have, but a lot of the brainstorming chapters, I have them go through those exercises because I find that students, have, not all students, but some students have trouble coming up with ideas. And, the brain is this instrument that wants to do that. Once it figures out how to do a thing, it wants to do that the easy way forever, right? And so these are just tools to trick yourself into doing something that you never do, so that your brain is forced to come at this, whatever problem you're solving from a new angle. So I find that that's really helpful. A lot of the stuff about juice, student games never, for good reason, right? But they never have juice. It's really rare to find a student game that's particularly juicy in my experience. And that's because they're just trying to get the game done in a reasonable amount of time, and they don't have time for that. So I essentially make them stop working on their game and juice for the last week. That's all I want to see. Whatever that was, however broken it was, juice it up.
Yeah, I used to tell my students that if an interaction didn't have 2 forms of feedback, then it wasn't a complete feature.
Yeah.
Which was a bit mean, but it's just that whole thing of if you don't learn to complete the feature with all of the feedback and everything, then you never become good at estimating how long it will take to do stuff as well. So but the stuff about brainstorming is really helpful, and I forgot that was there. I think the first time I read this was about 10-15 years ago, and I just got into working in games through I had a portfolio of hobby projects, and I went and read this to sort of professionalize myself. I was like, what should I have read already before I got this job? And I think I took for granted, I took it for granted at the time because I'd never read any other books on game development. And now going back to it, I'm like, wow, this is so much better than I remember it being. And these sections up the front, they might seem really obvious to some people, but I know from working with students, and particularly like 18-year-olds and stuff, that often many of them do need to learn this stuff, or to at least explicitly think about it, because they might have particular creative practices that are very good and other ones where they've just never considered, like, okay, I know how to have ideas, but how do I brainstorm in a group? There's a whole section on like the subconscious and the subconscious's role in creativity, and sleeping on an idea, how and why to take notes. I found that even now that was a helpful thing to get reminded of. Sometimes if you've got loads of ideas bouncing around in your head and you write them down, it's almost like you've partitioned them to a different hard drive, and you clear up all this virtual RAM in your head, and you can think clearly because you wrote the idea down, which is, I've been kind of telling other people this in a sideways way by telling them, like, often doing game design documents and stuff like that, it's not really making a plan or recording something for later on. Sometimes the writing is just part of thinking, and like you think through the thing as you turn it into words, which is one of the reasons why I hate ChatGPT so much. You know, if you want it to do some grunt work for you, like write something you don't want to write, that's fine, but it can never replace the actual active thinking that happens when you think something onto a notepad or something like that. And those sections I found really helpful to reread even now, because there's some just very high level how to do any sort of creative activity stuff in there that I think some people just never learn. You know, if someone comes from the kind of background where they don't have anyone in their life that works in the creative industries or is an artist and stuff, you just wouldn't ever have had a conversation with someone about these things, you know?
Yeah. And I think also too, that when you have like these strategies, like brainstorming tips or this information about the subconscious, I find a lot of students are very trepidatious about the quality of their ideas, or like they start worrying about this thing at the start, and it's like, no, it's probably a terrible idea, but it won't be when you're done with it, right? And so it gives them something else to focus on, right? And so I think a lot of times, the people that are interested in games have ideas, they just can't get past some self-judgment to get to them. And I like a lot of this stuff that lets you go through it. I like this story too. I don't know if you remember the Dali, like, holding a key in his hand and like sitting in a chair, and then he would just fall asleep and drop the key on a saucer, and it would wake him up, and then he would have all these like dream-like ideas that were just starting to form, and then he'd run and
Salvador Dali sort of trying to make himself sleep for a nanosecond by sleeping with something that would fall in his hand. Very, very strange. I mean, the links people go to have ideas. Can't remember the name of the Japanese inventor. He had the world record for the most number of patents at some point. Invented this. I think he invented the solar calculator. But he used to be into oxygen deprivation, and he would swim along the bottom of a pool for as long as possible because he thought he had his best ideas when he was like 45 seconds into swimming under the pool. And I think he actually invented tools for writing underwater to help himself.
It works. You got to do it.
Yeah, I like I said up the top, I think the people that dismiss this book for being impractical, there is so much stuff in here. Once we get into the process of game design and development, there is a lot of stuff in there about what is prototyping. That's something that keeps coming up with me. People send me their games to look at, and people don't really know the difference between a prototype and a vertical slice and all of these different types of stages a game can be in. And often they think a prototype is just a name that you give to the early stages of your game development. And it's like, no, a prototype is to answer questions. It's to basically decide whether you should keep doing something or not. In a lot of cases, it's like do we keep making this thing? Here's the questions we need to answer in order to do that. There's the section on prototyping in this is really robust. He will have his own estimation on something from his own studio that he's been running for a long time now, and then he'll have but Sid Meier says this, but this other game developer says this, and so on. So you get these kind of ballpark figures of like, oh, the first 30% of making a game is the prototype and stuff like that. But there's still a sense of, as there should be in any practical book about game development, of none of this is a hard science. Yeah. All of this is just different in different places. And I think it's kind of very encouraging to find out that even the people that really know what they're doing don't really know what they're doing. And there's a lot of that kind of thing in here.
Yeah. In that prototyping chapter, that's one of the things I've had mixed results, but the paper prototyping, having the students figure out what the problem area of their game is, what the difficult part is to know if it's going to work, and try to figure out what a paper prototype for that is. When I've had students that have been able to do it, it's worked really well. It's hard to blanket assign that to a class, because I think sometimes it's not clear what the problem is, or oftentimes maybe students have made something that doesn't really need prototyping, you're like pretty steadily down some genre where you're like, if I do all these things, it'll be fun, right? But yeah, that prototyping chapter I really like a lot, and he gives a lot of sort of concrete, like, here's how you do it, right? Like, here's my example, here's another example, here's one,
Yes, it's like we've got an example game, and it goes through several iterations, where in the first one it's like, oh, here are the questions we're trying to answer with the prototype, and then something changes.
I mean, you had the racing submarine one.
Yes, the racing submarine one. Yeah, some of the game examples are very, very silly, but it's kind of helpful because, like you say, there's certain things you don't need to prototype, right? Yeah. And if a student or if any game developer is making a game that is basically like a clone of another game with one thing changed, then there's only one thing that you need to test if it works there, and it's the new thing, Yeah. That's one of the things I try and do in my own practice. It's very difficult, but when you're making a new game and you've got a fresh idea in your head, it's like trying to stick to testing the things that you don't know whether they work yet. I've been working on a game for a couple of months. I haven't added any combat in, even though I know it will have combat eventually. It's because I know adding combat will make it fun. It's like, well, I don't need to test that idea. And so I think there's a really good, solid idea of what prototyping is in here. And it's not biased just towards the game design either. There's talk of like how you might prototype to test certain technical things. How many assets can we use and have on the camera at one time? And then there's talking about prototypes that aren't games, right? So it talks about parallelism, right? So having different prototypes going at once. And in Schell's definition of what a prototype is, concept art by the artists would be an example of a form of prototyping as well. They're saying this is what part of the game will look like, and you're not putting it in the build, you're not like putting it in the level environment art or anything like that, but that kind of concept art is still part of the prototyping process. And I think that seems kind of obvious if you've done it and you've worked in a kind of reasonable sized studio where everyone is working on their own prototype for their bit in their own little corner. But it's kind of helpful to hear it framed that way, because so often a lot of people use the term prototype as if it's like this holistic start of the game that has all of the elements in it.
Yeah, no, I've just been talking about prototyping because or writing about it for my tenure narrative, and a lot of what I've done in there early on is like just a prototype that I worked on for a week and then dropped. And then I worked on this prototype for a week and dropped it. And then I'm having to justify, like, this is the process, right? Or I've worked on these three things and threw this part away and added this piece in on this project. So yeah, I think all of that stuff is helpful. And I think, really the core of prototyping is you don't want to get too deep into your game while you're prototyping. You want to be able to throw something away or throw the whole game away if you're like, I can't make this work, or this sounded great, but these two ideas conflict in a way that's really, now clear to me when I'm trying to play with it. And I think one of the things I really like about prototyping, and I like about sort of this looser approach to it, is like, you don't have to have the full idea, right? You can start prototyping you can find that the thing that you thought was going to be great is actually not that interesting, but there's this other, knock-on bit that you're like, oh, wait, what if we push it in that direction? And so, I think that's just general prototyping stuff. But yeah.
Yeah, I think the first time I was in a sort of professional environment and heard someone use the phrase fail fast and find the fun,
yeah,
I just sort of like cringed myself inside out. And then when you see it in practice, it's like, oh no, that is what you need to do, because you just don't know what's going to be fun until you're interacting with it. And we get all of these stories about, bugs turning into features, like, creepers in Minecraft being an accident because it's, something happens and you go, actually, that's quite fun. And sometimes it's the inverse. Sometimes you think something's going to be fun and you just can't make it fun. You leave it in as a feature and you push it into a corner. One of the examples of that in AAA is Bethesda sort of accepted that they could never get the horse riding good in Skyrim. So instead of taking it out because they knew people liked having horses, they just relegated it. They didn't make it part of any quests or anything because they could never get their engine to load anything fast enough for the horses to ride really fast in a satisfying way. So that's kind of like thinking something's going to be fun and then realizing it's not, and it's like you don't really want to get rid of it, so you just don't make it central. You don't make it, an Assassin's Creed or a Zelda that's all about riding around on a horse, because you don't want to centralize something that you just can't get to work.
Or like one of my prototypes, I had this idea for this space. I basically had an idea for a UI element, and I made it, and it was great. And then I was like, okay, I don't have an idea for what to do with it, so I'm done for now. I'll, bank it and whatever. But
yeah, another section of this book that I was really impressed with, that I didn't really remember from the first time I'd read it, but had probably used since then, just didn't know where I'd got it from. There is a big section on probability and game math and chance, and it's like, I don't know, this is like 20 pages long. It's a short section, but these are topics that other people have written entire books on, right? So you get people like Jeff Engelstein, who's a sort of game design theorist and a board game designer mainly, will write an entire book. Like he did a recent one about loss aversion, right? So what goes on with people when they miscalculate chances of things, and what biases do we have, these psychological, and Jesse Schell sort of does this with randomness and how we miscalculate odds and stuff. But it's basically it's enough information to be a book in itself. Very easily. Like he could have stretched out this section of the book to be like 100-page book about chance and the difference between chance and skill in games, and where do you put one and the other. And there's a whole bit about how people generally cannot predict probabilities very well or do it very poorly. And we've had there is the example of where basically probability math, the whole branch of probability math, came out of a question about dice odds. So game studies, in a way, or game design theory, predicating this branch of math in a weird historical way. He's full of these weird little anecdotes.
Yeah, I think he has a link to the book at the end of the chapter.
Of course.
That story, so.
But yeah, that section was really fascinating, and there's a bit we sort of caps it off by saying judging odds is a skill that people can have, right? So people that are good at blackjack, people that are good at poker, all of these kinds of things, they are exercising a skill, even if it seems like they're not. And then there's like this spectrum he goes through where we have this real skill of judging odds, and then we have an imagined skill of being able to predict something when it's completely random, like of coin toss. And we have like an even more imagined skill that we seem to enjoy doing, of behaving or imagining as if we can control things that are completely random, right? So even the most rational person will roll a dice and go, come on, like we don't really believe we're affecting it, but we seem to get some enjoyment out of that moment of like pretending for a split second that we do think we can make our sort of D&D roll into a nat 20, or we can you know.
Yeah, or you get mad because you roll a 1 and then you take it, you put that die in dice jail, and then get another one.
Yeah, and it's like that. There's something about the way that he weaves all this together. He's incredibly well read on all of these topics, on like human psychology, on mathematics and probability, and he'll sort of weave back and forth between talking about one discipline, linking it to another discipline.
Yeah.
And then into these just really personal anecdotes that anyone can relate to, like, shouting at your own dice or something like that. And I don't really know how you could make this book any more approachable. Really, it's got something for everyone. It's really got like that kind of positivist backing things up with science as much as he can type thing. It's incredibly well referenced and gives you these kind of other studies you can go off and read. But then it's still, it doesn't fall too far into that, and actually talks about that right near the start of the book where he's kind of framing the book. He talks about, these different approaches to studying a subject and how you can be like a positivist science type person, or you can be, more phenomenological. He talks about that basically, and talks about, I think he talks about it in terms of psychology and how psychoanalysis was like phenomenological, and most of what passes for modern psychology is more sort of behavioralism, where it's done in a lab and you sort of count numbers of things and put it on a graph type thing. And he talks a lot about how you basically need to approach games from both of these perspectives to really understand them and be able to do things with them. That's kind of in the structure of the book throughout, of this kind of jumping between, here's some data on this thing, here's a funny anecdote, here's and I can sort of understand why certain people come into it expecting it to be a exactly how to do a thing type textbook would maybe find that frustrating, but I just think it's great.
Yeah, I get that. I think I mean, even with the book that you reviewed last month, right, I bounced off of it pretty hard because I came to it wanting it to be a certain thing that it wasn't, right? And I think that's possible with this too, right? That if you're like, especially if you're brand new and you're like, just tell me what code to type to make a game, it's like definitely not that. It's funny because that I spend some time on that balance chapter, right? The ones with the probabilities and thinking about that stuff in class, and students really, I found that they really struggled with it, right? Especially just really simple math, just thinking about the math of even probabilities and things like that. So I'm always like wishing that chapter had more nuts and bolts to it, but I think that's my background as a physicist, which is like, this is all so trivial. Like, let me have some meat here. But I do think it makes it approachable, and my students do end up coming out of it having a much better idea about, thinking about chance and figuring out why their game is horribly balanced and things like that, right? So
yeah, there's stuff to do with like relative value of things, which is very sort of algebraic thinking. So I think the most obvious example of that in video games would be like DPS, where it's like, if I have a gun that fires once a second and does 6 damage, and then I have another gun that fires 6 times a second and does a sixth, does 1 damage, then they're kind of equivalent, and you have this other thing, DPS, which kind of compares them, and he sort of takes you through. He doesn't actually use the gun example, that's just me being boring video game gun guy, but this sort of approach you can take for like, balancing units, where this side have the thing with lots of health but it's really slow, and this, so you sort of work out the relative values of things and so on. There is a kind of methodology for doing that there as well, but I think it's kind of like a Rorschach test, where any of us is gonna find an area of the book where we're like, oh, I wish there was more of this here.
Yeah. I do that with the story section, and then the world building section. I really wish there were a lot more in the world section.
I really like this story stack concept. I can't remember who he got it from. He got it from someone else. He cites them. But it's this idea that, a game has a central fantasy, and that is like the foundation of the story of the game, and it's like it's immovable, right? If you make a game about pirates, people expect a certain thing, and sure, you can go like high action pirates, or you can go silly Monkey Island pirates, but there's still a set of stuff that is like the central fantasy of pirates, and you can't deviate from it if you're doing that. And then on top of that, you build the actions of the game and what you can do. So your pirate game is probably not about cleaning a toilet unless you're deliberately playing that for laughs.
Right.
You've got the economy of the game, and then you've got like the actual story and the plot and what happens on top of that as the most flexible thing. And the way he explains it is you don't write the story first, because that's the most flexible thing. You start with the player fantasy and you work up from that. And the example is like some Tinkerbell game to do with playing as fairies. In the first iteration, you could do all these fairy things, and then they gave it to playtesters, and they were like, "But I want to fly."
Yeah.
Like, oh, okay, yeah, we've missed out. So the action that supports the central fantasy is actually how fairies move around and fly. So they changed that, and then they changed the economy of the game because they thought having coins didn't feel very fairy-ish either. So they turned it into a barter system where, you know, every shop would swap 2 acorns for this or 3 berries for this. The central fantasy of your game idea is at the bottom. It's the thing that every single game has. The action is on top of that and supported by it. The economy needs to sort of be explained in relation to all of this stuff. You know, you don't just randomly have coins in an economy where it doesn't make sense. Right. And then the story is like the thing you work out after all of that. And I think that's such a neat framework. And yeah, he doesn't spend a very long time on story, but I think that story stack concept and the way it's explained there is probably the most helpful, like it's definitely the most kind of universally helpful approach that you could give to anyone making any sort of game.
I think that's true, and I think that there's a lot of game development that I mean, even in AAA, right, where they bring in script writers from film to write this game, and then it's, you know, you run into the ludonarrative dissonance problem of like, well, there is a cool story here, but, you know, in between cutscenes, we're totally undermining it, right?
Yeah. Did you ever play the interactive fiction called The Writer Will Do Something?
I haven't, no.
So it's like you're in a boardroom and your character is the writer for this AAA game that's sort of like Halo crossed with Gears of War. And the game is called The Writer Will Do Something. And it's basically like you're a couple of months away from finishing the game. Everything's sort of going to shit. And everyone's kind of like airing their grievances about the game or what's gone wrong on the thing. And they're just like, the writer will fix it. It's very funny. People that are interested in kind of narrative and narrative focused games should play that, because it's a very funny interactive narrative about game narratives. But I mean, even thinking of some very narrative heavy games, they sort of do start from that well of, like, you know, Disco Elysium, for example. Everything, the story and the mechanics all emerge from let's play with all of the tropes of every cop movie. And one of the things when I'm a big Disco Elysium fan, I've been following all of the studios that have come out of it. And it's really interesting to see which bit they take from it to say, like, we're the real follow-on studio from this.
You can see who has gotten
sometimes it's the system, sometimes it's the art style and stuff like that. And it's like, I don't think there will ever be another Disco Elysium, because the genre territory that it's drawing on is so rich. And the ability to just go, oh, we've got these 5 different types of cop. We've got, like, you know, Charles Bronson kicking down the door, ask questions later type action movie cop. We've got this sort of very intellectual Sherlock. We've got this very emotional type character. And we've got, like, weirdo David Lynch, Dale Cooper type options. And to take that kind of fantasy from a genre and sort of draw everything out from that. And that's such a narrative heavy game, and you see it in other types of visual novels as well. That's one of the reasons why, you know, you have visual novels where the player character is like a journalist or some sort of character, often that is a detective or something adjacent to a detective. It's why Phoenix Wright works, right? We're in an alternate universe where the legal system is really weird, and for some reason, like, lawyers go to the crime scene and do a full investigation as if they're a PI. So yeah, I don't know. I just find that system really helpful, and I often find with games I look at where they've failed to do the story stuff, it is because they haven't built it up from that bit at the bottom. It's
they start at the top or something in the middle, and
Or they just have they have a main character. I see this loads in like indie sort of Zelda likes, Metroidvania, stuff like that. They have a main character that just doesn't have anything appealing about them.
Yeah.
And then they've built this big story up around them and this big world they're in, and it's just like, yeah, but why am I this guy? Well, it's just like a random kid or something, and it's like, what is cool about and you sort of almost want to sit people down and sort of get a big picture of Link up and go, right, this is why Link is cool, right? He's sort of like, you know, he's almost a knight. He's got a shield and stuff. He's doing his best. He's like scrappy, and you sort of like have to step people back through why they thought that character was cool when they were a kid. You know, what have they done with Sonic the Hedgehog to make you think he was cool when you were 8 years old? Right. You know, and it's just stuff that people often need help demystifying the media and understanding that every successful media object is a series of so many very deliberate decisions
that all come together seamlessly, right? That's why, you know, it seems like it was so easy. It must have been easy.
Yeah, so someone didn't just dream Sonic and then wake up and go, oh, I must write this down. I mean, maybe they did. I don't know about the origin, but I think this book does so much work in that area of taking stuff that maybe people who are, I don't like the idea of more creative, but people who have been maybe doing creative things for longer or something like that, things that certain types of people might take for granted and other types of people would just never have thought of.
Yeah.
And that can be quite tedious in parts, I think, maybe if you know these things already and you're like, I know how to brainstorm, I know how to take notes, why are you telling me this? But there's lots of people who don't know those things. And I think my experience as well of teaching internationally is there's very different educational cultures in different places, and lots of people never get an education where they're asked what they think about things. And design is so much of that, you know. You can't be taught it as a series of facts about things, you know. Maybe there have been times in history where that was the case, and you might have gone to learn architecture and you had a lecturer that was really into Gothic or brutalism, and they said, this is how you should design a building. But
I mean, design, right? Proper design is at its core solving a problem or a series of problems, right? And if you're not solving problems, I don't know what you're doing. You might be doing something that somebody else did as design, but you're sort of mimicking that. I mean, that takes us to the lens of problem solving, I guess. But
well, I mean, I'll just read out. There's a little book that comes with the deck of lenses here, and it's kind of written in a cheeky way. I quite like Schell's sense of humor when he's being silly. There's an anecdote in there about how he makes sense of abstract images, and it's got Charlie Brown in it, and it's sort of like, if you look closely at Charlie Brown, there's all sorts of things wrong with him. His hands are little bumps, and worst of all, he's all made of lines. There's something about his writerly voice that I find really funny. But in the little booklet for the deck of lenses, it says how to design a game. The secret truth is that all games are designed the same way. Step 1, think of an idea for a game. Step 2, try it out. No, really, try it out. You have to play games to see if they work. Step 3, figure out what was wrong with it and change it so that it's better. Then go back to step 2. Steps 1 and 2 you can do for yourself, but step 3 is where you need the deck of lenses. This deck has been specially designed to help you find game problems and figure out how to fix them. So it's even acknowledging here, if you think of the order of those steps, that the design is separate from the development, the implementation, the construction, whatever you want to call it. Because step 2 is try it out, right? So one of the reasons people would bounce off this is if they have no capacity to actually try out their idea. So, you know, someone that has never used a game engine, or someone who has never used a game engine and thinks board games and stuff are so boring that they would never test out an idea using dice and cards and stuff like that. I can understand why someone will bounce off it there, but it's even even the way that's structured is kind of telling you, no, you need to make your game, and then once you've made your game, you iterate on it, and this is to help you make the thing better once you're in that stage of iterating on it. You mentioned earlier that there were some parts of the book that you found not so helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think the story section, a couple of weaknesses. The one that really drives me crazy is the games take place in a world, and then he doesn't really talk about making a game world. He just immediately jumps to like transmedia, like, now that you've got a game world that people love, here's how you make it into movies. And you know, for that chapter, I feel like he basically skipped the topic and then talked about what should have been like an addendum, in my opinion, on the end of the chapter. Because it really doesn't, like, I think it comes right after, I don't know, it's in this story character area, but
it's like, I feel like it's one of his blind spots because of his position. It's like he's worked in this very unusual, it's a very unusual situation to be making games in. You've got Disney, you've got one of the biggest corporations in the world, and they're basically giving you free reign to make all sorts of weird stuff. And that is just not how most game development works. You don't have the IP power behind what you're doing to basically make weird stuff with it. And I mean, like, if I think of my first job, we were doing loads of things with other people's IP. So we weren't world building, really. We were like taking an existing transmedia thing and trying to make a thing that sort of existed within that. And for a new indie developer, they're trying to develop their own IP to some degree. And often they'll be more successful by being kind of minimalist about that, the Spelunkys of the world, all of these types of indie games, even something like Binding of Isaac that's a bit heavier on the narrative, is still leaving so much to the imagination. It doesn't have reams and reams of lore and backstory, and that's developers playing to their strengths and just doing something evocative, which I guess brings us back to the story stack again as well. It's like, it's more the broadly evocative element of the game is perhaps more important than like individual bits of plot and all of that kind of stuff, because to be good at plot, you probably need to be a strong writer as well, and we can't all be good at everything.
I mean, I think he could have said that in here, right? And I think, like, even like what you were saying with when you're working with somebody else's IP, I think you could have something about that, right? How you might have to make a game that is less good than you would want in some respect, because this IP is bigger than your game, right? So you can't harm this IP by doing this in the game. You're hurting the the cash cow that is justifying this game, so you can't do that. Maybe that's even why he did so little on that, but I think it is a crutch that I'm sure you've seen students that come in with like reams of lore that they're ready to put into something, and they're telling you about their game, and your eyes just roll back in your head because like you would care if you could play the game, but
I'm like, I don't care about this in games that I really like, So that's a weak area. One of the other things it's definitely worth flagging is I think it's written in a very sensitive way, but there is a lot of very kind of conservative talk about differences between men and women and boys and girls in this. I think the way it's approached has aged very, very well.
In the third edition, if you go back to the second edition, like that was one of the big changes.
I think I was reading the second edition, but I mean, the thing is, he frames it and he comes in at the start and he's like, these things are stereotypes, and these different people are different in certain ways, and we can develop stereotypes about that, and it's not true for everyone to say boys like this, girls like this, but there are statistical kind of things we can point to, and we're not saying that people who are boys shouldn't like this pink thing and people who are girls shouldn't like this ultra-violent thing, but it's kind of ignorant to not accept that there are these patterns. And he sort of frames it all very sensitively, I think, but then kind of goes on about it for another sort of 10 or 20 pages in a way that kind of by the end of it, you've sort of forgotten that preface was there. And a lot of it is situated in, like, there's the example of building this Disney ride, where it's Pirates of the Caribbean and you shoot cannons and you turn the wheel and everything. And he's talking about like observing the different players and the positions they took and getting the mums into it by positioning them so they were behind the family, and then they were interested in steering the ship because they could see the family and they wanted to protect the family and the ship, and they also wanted to take this position of like making sure everyone else was having fun, which was kind of the natural role that they fell in. I say natural, maybe the learned role that they fell into in that situation. And that's a really good observation, but it's only one that comes from designing a family ride at Disneyland that like none of us are ever going to get to do. I'd love to build a 4-player pirate ship ride, but it just doesn't apply. But I mean, I think the way that is approached, some people would find it objectionable and not want it in there at all. So like, what was the first edition like in those terms?
I had a bunch of students that would come in, so our program has, trans students, gay students, and so they would come in and they'd be like, "This is bullshit," for that chapter, which was actually okay too, in terms of like us having a discussion in class about demographics and how roles change over time and accepted behaviors and whether that's society or genetics or what is this, so we could have some talk about that, but it was really just. It was more or less the same thing, but it's gotten, I think, a lot softer. I think it was more in the second edition. It was a lot more matter of fact. Like, well, here's the differences between boys and girls, and then the next one, it's like, here's some, stereotypes about differences.
Yes. It's all framed as like, here's what some people think. Not what I, Jesse Schell, think. So examples of things like women historically enjoying hidden object games, and then there being like an evolutionary explanation for that, because for evolutionary psychologists, everything we do is based on who we were 50,000 years ago, and we haven't changed at all since then on some level, which is like incredibly reductive. But he does sort of frame it as like, this is one way of looking at this. It is not people's destiny. It's just something to think about. And I mean, we do still have very heavily gendered game genres. It's just we've sort of cushioned it ourselves within the like the whole discourse around cozy games at the moment is like a kind of cipher for gender. No one really calls them girly games, but the aesthetic and who streams them, who are the popular streamers in that space, it does tend to be femme streamers or queer streamers and stuff like that. So it's still a thing. It's that kind of, what's the ratio of cushioning, I guess, because I did find when I got towards the end of that section on demographics, I was like, I've had enough of this now. But it was framed in a way that I think people would maybe not react to it so badly.
I mean, I think that's one of those things that of everything in this book, I feel like the society's take on demographics is the one that's probably changing the most rapidly, right? And so
there's this kind of classic product design approach, the way you sort of have a imaginary player. I worked at a big sort of match 3 company, and we did this. We had sort of player archetypes or avatars or whatever you want to call them, and we sort of imagined how they would feel about things when we did them. But with like a small indie game, I don't think people do that so much. I think it's much more, you're an auteur and you're just making things for people with the same taste as you, and they might have the same body as you or be from the same country, but that's largely irrelevant. It's much more to do with taste profiles rather than other stuff. I don't know. Yeah,
and you wonder though if you are, I mean, just making a game for yourself, how that might be the person that is bouncing off of this. Like, I know what I want. I don't need this thing to tell me what other people want.
I mean that is a big part of people's reaction to this book, I think, is you've got like professional design is making things for other people, right? And so much of this book is about that. It is basically coming from the assumption that when we say design, we mean design in a professional context, and you might have things you like and things you don't like, but generally speaking, you need to learn to empathize with all sorts of people, because it's assumed you're not just making what you want, you're making things for other people, right? And everything in this framework is kind of written from that perspective. But I mean, the thing I see a lot in the indie space, particularly in people that are just kind of working on their first game, maybe they're very technically competent and they've been using a game engine for 3 or 4 years, but they're not confident in this sort of creative side of things. They're not confident in like the branding of their game or who the character is or anything like that. And often I come at that more from this perspective of like, design is having opinions about what a good game is, and design is having a taste and like a philosophy of what should be in a good game, and then just expressing that through what you make, which is kind of the opposite of this to a degree, because the kind of commercial design approach or the professional design approach is much more, any game could be a good game, it's just all about context. And I think that's fundamentally what a lot of this book is about. It's putting you in these imaginary situations where you've got to make a game for this person, Do they like chance? Do they like skill? That's just not how we most of us make games, is it really? Right,
no. But I still think even in that with that sort of view of it, I think the lenses are still like, just going back to what I said earlier, which is like, pull out the lens and justify why you don't care about this lens.
Yeah.
Because even, like I was thinking about the channels and dimensions, the one about how is the UI giving you, or the interface giving you information. You have a number maybe, and it can be flashing, it can be red, how much information is it giving? That's the kind of stuff that even if you're making a game for yourself, you may not, think of maximizing this thing, because you run into that problem of you made the game, so
yes,
where all the information is and how to jump all the gaps and whatever it is, right? But the next person that comes along doesn't. So even if they are just like you and they would love it, they didn't make it, so they don't know what's going on.
I review at least 4 games a week in some pre-launch stage, and that is one of the weakest areas. It is the communication, it is the taking for granted that the player understands. Really common one is character takes damage and health bar goes down, and there's communication on the UI level, but there's nothing happen in the diegesis to show that the character is hurt or that kind of stuff. And that's the section you're talking about. What information is available to me at any given time? I once heard a UI designer describe it as my job is to think about all of the game variables that are at play at any given moment and to decide which ones to pump up into the player's consciousness through what I do. And that's kind of what he's talking about here. All of the kind of neurocognitive stuff in this book is helpful for anyone, regardless of what they're doing, whether they're just doing passion project or whether they're trying to become a professional designer, because it's the only stuff that really is where the kind of universal rules of games and how to make good games what lives is. There isn't really game design theory that is universalizable. Most of the stuff that is universalizable is this stuff to do with human perception, human cognitive biases, the kind of psychology of pleasure and reward and punishment and all that kind of stuff. And that's all in there. Hopefully at some point on this podcast I'll find another book that has all of this stuff comprehensively presented in such an interesting way, but it's setting a very high bar, I think. That's
this is my range of interests are all over the map. And so when I had been making games for a while, when I found this book, and then I was like, just shocked. I was like, oh, I hadn't been thinking about these things at all, and I didn't know you could do this, or that I should be considering this, right? Or also, this is why, for example, I had that epiphany when I was reading this originally, that I really liked Diablo I. Mm-hmm. And even though in basically every regard Diablo II is a better game, I didn't like it as much. And it came to do with that sort of the skill curve was absolutely linear, right? Every item you get is like 1% better than the last thing, so that when the monsters, the skeletons are 1% more difficult, you just got the sword that's whatever. And they had balanced it for for me within an inch of its life. And I was like, oh, I like that. Like I would find a bow and then mow people.
the bumpy difficulty ride, which he talks about in here, and you see this so much where people talk about flow theory in game design theory generally, and they sort of introduce it, and then they don't really go into the optimum pattern, which he does, which is basically you don't want a smoothly increasing challenge curve. You want to have moments where the game feels too easy and then moments where the game feels too hard and frustrating.
But yeah, I like that because I think that a lot of times, I mean, there is so much unintended frustration, especially for a game that is new, or students are first making a game, that it becomes like, get rid of all the frustration, right? Mm-hmm. If you can, but frustration of being defeated over and over again. He talks about that too in here, right? That like players get upset whenever the monsters get easier after they kill them the fourth time. And you're like, no, I want to kill that guy that's been killing me. Not
the basically the auto balancing thing.
Yeah,
like when is it okay to do auto balancing and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I'm coming back briefly to the thing about making for specific player types and demographics, and how that's more of a commercial game dev thing than something hobbyists would do. To think of an example of that happening in indie, I think it's George Fan who did Plants vs Zombies, which
Yeah.
was an indie game. I know now we think of it as a big sprawling franchise, but it was like a solo developer making an indie game at the start. He made that because he was a massive fan of tower defense games, and he wanted to make one that his mum could play. And so she was his player avatar, was like, you know, all of his design decisions were like, will my mum understand this? and then you look at the game and it's like, oh yeah, I can see that, because everything is designed to make sense to someone who's never played a tower defense game before. It's in the title of the game. Plants are stationary things and zombies are slow, threatening things.
That keep coming.
Yeah, and like think of the story stack again, the economy being part of the story stack, and the economy of sunshine being there instead of coins, and sunflowers generate sunshine, which doesn't make sense, but it does make sense in a kind of silly, funny way. And yeah, that was a indie developer kind of working that way, and people don't think in that way very often in terms of like player personas. But if you're making a type of game where you can imagine a type of person that would be like the most into it, holding that person in your head as you make decisions about the game, because you might be someone with a really broad set of interests, but then if you start making a game about samurais or something like that, it's like, well, I need to make this game be for samurai nerds or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, I had this interview with Chris Zukowski recently talking about game marketing, and he gave me this kind of piece of information that, you know, he was talking to an indie developer who'd made millions of dollars on their game, and the amount of people that had bought it on Steam was like less than 1% of the entire Steam audience, because there's, you know, millions and millions of people on there. And that sort of highlights just how, particularly in the indie space, it's like you are going for people that are super nerds about one thing. And that thing might be a particular genre, it might be deck builders, or it might be a thematic thing like squirrels, I don't know.
Yeah.
And I think maybe it does pay to have this idea of who your ideal player is in your head, because if you can make it perfect for that person, then there's probably like a few thousand clones of that person out there that would be like the ideal person for this game. You just have to trust that they exist.
Yeah.
You know?
Especially if they're a game dev also, right? Because there's a marketing book called Purple Cow by Seth Godin, and he talks about how you know, for something to go viral, you need sneezers, you need people who are going to sneeze on everybody else, right? And so game developers are the ones that like they find a thing and then, you know, that they're nuts about, and then they rave about it in the spaces. So like things like Balatro or Blueprints like explode because the game developers are, you know, get stoked about it early on.
Well, that's the thing again. It's like that idea of a designer being a tastemaker, right? I was talking about earlier of like part of being a quote unquote good designer is just having opinions about it, not just kind of like going, what do you want me to make? And so much of this book is about giving you the language and the set of cognitive tools to be able to do that. You know, both in a commercial context where you're just trying to make someone else happy, and for your own stuff, to be able to like get a tighter understanding of what it is you're trying to do and how to do that thing well. Hopefully this has given people enough of a understanding of what to expect from the book that they're going to go into it if they want to and not get too many surprises, I guess. And if people read it before and were put off by it for whatever, maybe they'll go back and revisit it after this. And I think a lot of it just comes down to, what do you think design is? And you know, it's not the practical part of making the game, it's the kind of thoughtfulness that goes into it to make it a particular game, I guess. I think that's true, and I think this is for me this is a great book just because it tells you all of this stuff, but the real base of it is it's asking you questions, right? Questions for you to ask yourself. And so, you know, if it's making you ask yourself a question that's irrelevant, then ignore it and go find the questions that mean something to you, right? So I think even if that is only a third of this book is good for me, there's still find the third of it that is good. I think if you go in expecting the right thing, it's hard for me to imagine a world where somebody hates this book, I guess, because I love it so much. There's plenty of them out there. They're all on Reddit. They're all foaming at the mouth on Reddit. Oh, this book is so fluffy. It's so, it's about experience. I do think, and I won't go into this in too much depth, but I do think there is a very macho component in certain parts of game dev culture that just doesn't like talking about experience.
Yeah.
Even though that's what games are. As soon as you start talking about emotions in games or giving people joy or, God forbid, talking about giving people pleasure, it's like, no, we're just making a game to make some money. It's like, well, if you're going to make a good game, you need to start thinking about this stuff, because this is what makes good games good games.
I mean, from that perspective, right, I think the first lens is the lens of emotion. So lens number one, they're out.
They're out. But, you know, I mean, the digital version of the deck of cards is online. I will put a link to it in the show description. You can get so much value out of just messing about with that, and then if you kind of use that and you think it's helpful after you've used that and applied that to a game you're already working on, then maybe go and check out the book later on. But it's an incredibly low stakes investment to just go and look at it on a website. And I really think people that have read the whole book and bounced off of it have maybe just not applied it. You know, I know that can sound a bit kind of pyramid scheme to go, well, you didn't feel it. Oh, it's because you just didn't do it properly. You know, but there are parts of it that are going to be relevant to you at certain times, and other parts that are going to be useful. But that's what happens when something tries to be comprehensive like that. You know. Thank you so much, Jeremy. I think we'll end it there. But if there's anything you want to plug or share with people, if you've got a link to a game you're working on or a website, I'm happy to put that in the description so people can check that out if they want to know more about what you're doing.
Gosh, I should have waited another 6 months when I have the game that I'm working on ready to go public. So right now, no. If you want to take my class, you can come to Austin and enroll in school. Outside of that,
I hope people at home have found this helpful. This podcast is part of Indie Game Clinic. I have a Patreon at patreon.com/Indie Game Clinic, and if you subscribe there, that's kind of one of the things that helps fund this. Helps me buy books and decks of cards that tell me what to do, so that I can think that I'm a real game designer and all of that kind of stuff. Hope you've enjoyed hearing from Jeremy here, who has read this book probably 6 or 7 times more than I have. And thank you, and see you next time.
The game developers